So this year we focused our AI research in two areas. The first is cost declines, and we'll explore cost declines over the last 6 years in AI, and then talk about expectations for future cost declines through 2030. The second area of focus is market sizing, and we'll talk about the overall opportunity for AI and what it looks like today versus what it could look like in 2030. So just jumping in, before we get into the numbers, I want to frame why cost declines matter. And if you look at the adoption of technology historically, cost declines have led to democratization. So the less expensive a technology or innovation is, the more people have access to it. And we see the same thing happening with AI. So typically, the larger a model is, the larger a neural network, the more performant it is, the better it performs. And the problem right now is neural networks are quite expensive to train. And so if we look at something like GPT-3, which is a 175 billion parameter language model, and it's considered to be a top performing model, in 2020 it costs about $4.6 million to train. And that's quite a bit of money. And if we think about research organizations, universities, nonprofits, oftentimes they don't have the budget for that. Um, but with cost declines, it's becoming much less expensive. And so as cost declines, we're seeing more access and creating more availability for organizations like universities and nonprofits. At the other end of the spectrum, well-funded organizations like OpenAI are able to continue pushing the boundaries of what's possible in terms of model size and performance. So as costs decline, they can continue increasing the size of the models and the performance of their models. So just to put this into context, again, GPT-3 cost about $4.6 million to train in 2020. If we went back to 2015, we estimate it would have cost about $875 million to train a model of that size. So we saw a cost decline at about 65% a year from $875 million in 2015 to $4.6 million in 2020. And based on our analysis, we think that costs will continue to decline at about 60% a year. So we could see a cost decline all the way down to $500 by 2030. So that's a decline from $875 million to just over $500 in 15 years, which is pretty incredible. And to break this down a little bit further, typically when we model cost declines at ARK, we do so with Wright's Law. And that's exactly what we did with AI. So we conducted two different studies to model cost declines in AI. The first is the cost of compute. So this is the cost of hardware and the computers that are actually used to train neural networks. And we believe, based on our analysis, that those costs will decline at about 39% a year through 2030. The second study we did looked at the amount of compute required by neural networks. And based on our analysis here, we think that's going to decline at about 37% a year through 2030. And so those combine to create cost declines of about 60% a year, which is how we get that GPT-3 estimate of $4.6 million in 2020, all the way down to $500 in 2030. So shifting to the market opportunity for AI, we think one of the most useful applications of AI will be making human knowledge workers more productive. And knowledge workers are software developers, accountants, lawyers, etc. And we did an analysis here to look at the types of tasks these knowledge workers do on a daily basis and try to predict how much AI could improve their productivity. And on average, we think that AI will increase the output of knowledge workers by about 140%. So that more than doubles the output of a knowledge worker, which is really, really exciting for a number of reasons. One of which is that in many of these job categories, like software developers, there's actually a labor shortage right now. If you talk to any large tech company, it's quite difficult to attract and retain software developers. And while it's really hard to just make more software developers, we think that AI could bridge that gap and make the software developers that we do have more productive. So we're very much excited to see how that plays out. And it's not a pipe dream. This is something that's real and it's here today. OpenAI has a tool called Codex, which could be thought of as Google Translate for software engineers. A developer can put in an English language command, like make a red ball bounce on the screen, and Codex will actually generate software code, functional software code, that they can use in production. And there are software engineers who are using Codex today in their real jobs. According to OpenAI, it's about 37% accurate. So it can complete coding tasks with about 37% accuracy. But based on the rate of improvement over the last year, we think that that will increase and improve quite quickly. So if we zoom out and look at the macro here, we think that by 2030, AI can improve the output or increase the output of human knowledge workers by about $56 trillion a year. And to put this in perspective, by 2030, we think knowledge workers will have an output of about 41 trillion, just alone, just humans. But if we combine humans with AI, we think that output will hit $97 trillion. So that's a huge step up in human output. Now, we think that companies and organizations are going to be willing to pay about 25 cents for every incremental dollar in output, which would suggest the market for AI software will be about $14 trillion in 2030. Now, enterprise or companies currently spend about $1 trillion a year on enterprise software. And so we would see a step up from $1 trillion a year today to $14 trillion in 2030, which would represent a 42% compound annual growth rate. So the demand for software will likely drive a demand for hardware. The more models that we have and the larger these models become, the more compute we need to actually train these models. And so we think that the market for compute for AI will increase from about 17 billion today to about $1.7 trillion in 2030. And to put this in the perspective of overall IT spend, IT spend historically has hovered between 4 and 5% of GDP. And so in 2020 or 2022, companies spend just under $5 trillion a year on IT. And consensus forecasts would suggest that by 2030, that number will be just over $5 trillion. But we think the demand for AI could actually increase that number by about $15 trillion, suggesting that spend in IT could grow from just under 5 trillion today to just over $20 trillion by 2030. So if we're right, the adoption of AI could lead to one of the greatest periods of wealth creation in human history. AI companies today are worth about $2.5 trillion. And our analysis suggests that by 2030, those companies could be worth, or companies in general, could be worth $87 trillion. And this is a combination of companies building both AI applications, the underlying models and software that power those applications, as well as the hardware and compute that's used to train those models.
These robots aren't assembling cars. They're the big attraction in Beijing's latest smart restaurant. AI in the kitchen and automated waiters. I have a meeting here with the design researcher Gesche Just. A former internet ambassador for the German government, she's currently spending a research semester at Tongji University in Shanghai. I ask her about her impressions of China.
There's this real hunger in the city, and it's super fun to talk to young people because they want to be the motors of change. They work day and night. They have a new work-life balance model. It's called 996. I thought, what do you mean 996? And they said, we work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. That's the better model now, because they used to just work non-stop. But no one's stopping. No one's hitting the brakes. They work like crazy because they want to bring about change. This restaurant cost $20 million, just the one restaurant. They've invested this huge sum to digitize the entire operation. They aren't just robots serving the food, the whole kitchen is digitized. Refrigeration is monitored, supply chains are monitored, there are dashboards for everything. Everything is connected here, where they're testing what works and which aspects can be implemented in other restaurants of this chain. That's the idea here, to just try things and to think big.
Hello. Hi.
So I'll just help myself, if I may.
Super.
你好，你谢谢。
谢谢。
But what about privacy?
There's seen to be a trade-off between security and privacy. You often hear how AI has increased public safety, for instance, that the ubiquitous surveillance cameras have dramatically increased the crime-solving rate. It's hard for us to relate to because privacy and personal rights are so important for Germans. But here there's a different tradition and take on the issue.
I'm fascinated by China, but it also puzzles me. How can they be reconciled? The high civilization of ancient China and the modern industrial state, with surveillance cameras everywhere. The Longgan district in Shenzhen. In the heart of China's booming economic region north of Hong Kong, we visit the Smart City Control Center. A giant monitor displays the data of the entire district in real time. Numbers of new residents by neighborhood to plan schools, water supply levels, power outages. All this information is collected, compiled, and evaluated using artificial intelligence. The Showcase project was developed with Chinese tech giant Huawei. Chief engineer Chen Bangtai tells me the city now operates more efficiently.
Okay.
So what you're doing here is urban planning.
Yes. The systems are a big help.
These are hospital beds. Right now, there are 15,000 doctors and nurses and 7,600 beds. So is Shenzhen currently healthy or sick? A smart surveillance system scans the entire city. Illegal structures, like this one on a roof, are quickly identified and demolished. To me, some of this feels like the backdrop to a science fiction movie. Employees with live streaming body cams inspect side streets. This is total surveillance. Chen shows me how cameras installed in restaurant kitchens even keep tabs on cleanliness. But doesn't the chef mind being monitored all the time?
The system logs all the people who view the images. Anyone who looks at them without permission is punished.
Total transparency for the purpose of progress. Chen says residents of Longgang District approve. Jaywalking is not allowed, and offenders are immediately identified. Look here. You jaywalk once, and right away your social credit score drops. This degree of surveillance is unthinkable in the West. But here in China, they take a different view and say it's driven a drop in crime. What does it say here?
Male youth without glasses.
Youth?
Yes, suddenly you're a youth.
I love Chinese facial recognition. Youth. A transparent society in the interest of efficiency. Some of this appears useful, but do we really want to measure, control, and analyze everything just because it's technically possible? Won't that inevitably lead us down a road to data dictatorship? Maybe trust is better than smart control.